Sarah had always been the kind of woman people didn't notice at first glance. She lived a quiet life in a small town, surrounded by books, numbers, and memories of what could have been. Every morning, she followed a simple routine. She woke up early, made a cup of tea, and sat by her window watching the world outside. To anyone else, she looked like an ordinary woman, simple clothes, soft eyes, and a gentle smile. But behind that simplicity was a mind that once amazed teachers, professors, and mathematicians. Years ago, Sarah had been one of the brightest students in her college. Numbers came to her as easily as breathing. She could solve complex equations in minutes, the kind that took others hours to understand. Her professors believed she was destined to do great things, perhaps even become one of the youngest mathematicians to publish her own research. But life, as it often does, had other plans. When her mother fell ill, Sarah left everything behind: her studies, her scholarships, her dreams. She devoted her time to taking care of her mother, never complaining, never regretting. Years passed, and by the time her mother's health stabilized, Sarah found herself far away from the academic world she once loved. She worked small tutoring jobs, teaching local kids math after school. She didn't earn much, but she found peace in helping others learn. One afternoon, while teaching a young boy how to divide fractions, the boy's father walked in. He was a college lecturer who often visited the city's education center. After watching Sarah teach, he said, "You're very good at this. Have you ever thought of joining an advanced program again?" Sarah smiled faintly. "It's been years since I studied formally," she replied. "You should try," he encouraged. "There's a new mathematics course at the National Training Center. It's for professionals and educators. You'd fit right in." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The idea kept echoing in her mind. Could she really go back? Would she even be accepted after all these years? Her heart wanted to try, but her mind whispered doubts. Still, the spark that had once made her fall in love with numbers flickered again. The next morning, she gathered her documents, polished her old certificates, sent in an application. 2 weeks later, she received an acceptance letter. The course was being conducted in the city, a place she hadn't visited in a long time. The instructor's name was Professor Daniel Lewis, a respected mathematician known for his sharp intellect and strict teaching style. He was famous for pushing his students hard and dismissing anyone he thought wasn't serious enough. Sarah knew it would be a challenge, but she wanted to learn again. She wanted to feel that joy of solving problems that once made her heart race. On the first day of class, she arrived early. The building was tall, modern, and surrounded by students carrying laptops and expensive bags. Sarah walked in quietly, wearing a plain blue dress and carrying a small notebook. Most of the other students were younger, confident, and well-dressed. They looked at her curiously, whispering among themselves. Some smiled politely, others ignored her completely. When she took her seat, she overheard 2 students talking behind her. "Why is she here?" "This is an advanced class," one of them whispered. "Maybe she's someone's assistant," the other laughed. Sarah pretended not to hear. She opened her notebook and began reviewing the formulas. She had studied the night before. When Professor Daniel entered the room, everyone went silent. He was tall, serious-looking, and his voice carried authority. "Welcome to the Advanced Mathematics program," he said firmly. "This is not a place for casual learners. If you're here for fun, you might as well leave now." His eyes scanned the room and stopped at Sarah. For a moment, he frowned slightly, almost as if questioning her presence. But he said nothing and continued with the lecture. As the class progressed, Daniel wrote complex equations on the board, explaining theories about number patterns and logic sequences. The students took notes quickly, struggling to keep up. Sarah, however, followed each step with ease. She didn't raise her hand or show off, but her eyes sparkled with understanding. For her, it felt like coming home. During a break, some students gathered near the board, trying to discuss the last problem Daniel had given them. Sarah quietly solved it in her notebook, then stood up to get a drink of water. On her desk, she left the paper with her solution. When she returned, she noticed a few students looking at it in surprise. "She solved it," one of them whispered. "And it's correct." Sarah smiled softly and sat back down. She didn't need to prove herself. She was there to learn. But her calm confidence started to make a few students curious. Who was this quiet woman who solved problems so easily? Meanwhile, Professor Daniel noticed her too. He saw her correct solutions and her silent focus. But instead of being impressed, he felt slightly irritated. He didn't like students who didn't ask questions or show effort. She must have copied it, he thought, at the end of the day. As students left the classroom, Daniel called out, "You, Miss Sarah, right?" She turned politely. "Yes, Professor. You seem very confident for someone who hasn't spoken all day," he said. "Let's see if that confidence holds tomorrow. I'll give you a problem worth your attention." Sarah nodded quietly. "I'll try my best, sir." As she left the building, she could hear a few students whispering again. "She's going to regret it," one said. Professor Daniel never goes easy on anyone. Sarah smiled faintly as she walked out into the sunset. She wasn't afraid. After all, she had already faced life's hardest problems. What was one more math equation compared to that? That night, as she sat by her window with a cup of tea, she looked at the city lights twinkling in the distance. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Excitement? Not for fame, not for recognition, but for the pure joy of rediscovering the genius that still lived quietly inside her. Tomorrow, she thought, would be the start of something new. She had no idea that the next day would not only test her skills, but also reveal to the world the brilliance she had kept hidden for so long. Asterisk. Professor Daniel Lewis was a man who lived and breathed numbers, but unlike Sarah, his love for mathematics wasn't gentle. It was proud, sharp, and full of ego. He had spent years building his reputation as one of the most brilliant instructors in the city. To his students, he was a genius. To his colleagues, he was a perfectionist. But to those who looked deeper, he was a man who valued titles more than talent, appearances more than ability. Every morning, Daniel arrived at the National Training Center dressed immaculately, a crisp suit, polished shoes, and a silver watch that gleamed like his ambition. His lectures were famous for their complexity, and he often reminded his students that only the best minds could survive his class. Mathematics, he would say, is not for everyone. It demands intelligence, discipline, and pedigree. Pedigree, that was the word Sarah didn't have when she had walked into his classroom for the first time. Daniel had noticed her immediately. Her plain dress, her calm demeanor, her small notebook instead of a laptop. Everything about her seemed out of place among the confident young scholars in branded clothes. He didn't say anything then, but in his mind, he had already decided she wouldn't last a week. Daniel had a reputation for breaking students who didn't meet his standards. He believed the world was divided into two kinds of people, the brilliant and the average. And in his eyes, Sarah looked painfully average. That morning, as he prepared for his second lecture, Daniel stood by the large window in his office, sipping black coffee. He reviewed the student list on his tablet. "Sarah Williams," he muttered, scrolling past her name. Background, small-town tutor. No recent academic record. He smirked. Another dreamer. When he entered the classroom, the students straightened up instantly. His presence alone demanded silence. He placed his notes on the table and looked around the room. "Today," he began, "we'll be working on advanced logic integration. If you can't keep up, that's your problem, not mine." The students chuckled nervously. They were used to his harsh tone. Sarah, sitting near the back, simply nodded and began writing. Daniel's eyes swept across the room and landed on her. She wasn't looking up, just quietly working. Something about her calmness irritated him. "You there?" he said sharply. "Sarah?" "Right." She looked up politely. "Yes, Professor. Did you understand what I just explained?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Then tell me what's the derivative result if the integration variable is exponential in both the numerator and denominator?" The room went silent. Even the top students looked confused. It wasn't a simple question. It was something he hadn't even fully explained yet. Sarah paused for a moment, then stood up slowly. Her voice was gentle but steady. "It would depend on whether the limits are fixed or infinite, sir," she said. "If they're fixed, the exponential term cancels partially and the function stabilizes into a convergent form." Daniel froze for a moment. That was correct. Completely correct. And she hadn't hesitated. The class looked at her in surprise. One student whispered, "She's right." But Daniel's pride wouldn't let him show approval. He adjusted his glasses and said curtly, Lucky guess. Sit down." Sarah didn't argue. She nodded respectfully and took her seat. The rest of the class continued, but Daniel's mind was elsewhere. Her answer had caught him off guard. He had expected confusion, maybe silence, not clarity. He couldn't help but glance at her a few more times during the lecture. She wrote with a focused stillness that bothered him. She didn't look nervous or desperate for attention. She looked confident. After the lecture, Daniel walked to the staff room where his colleague, Professor Clark, was grading papers. "New student in my class," Daniel said casually, pouring himself another cup of coffee. "Sarah Williams. Seems like she knows a bit more than she should." Clark looked up with a smile. "Oh, her. I've heard about her. Small-town tutor, right? Some say she used to be a math prodigy back in the day." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Prodigy?" "Yeah," Clark said. "Apparently, she won a national math competition years ago. Then she disappeared. No one knows why." Daniel leaned back, his curiosity growing. "Interesting. Let's see if that story still holds true." The next day, he came prepared, not just with lessons, but with a plan. He wanted to expose Sarah to test whether her knowledge was genuine or just luck. During the lecture, he began asking random questions, difficult ones, each trickier than the last. Sarah answered each of them calmly, without arrogance, without showing off. Every answer was right. By the end of class, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years. Irritation mixed with admiration. He didn't want to admit it, but she was good. Very good. After class, he stopped her as she was leaving. "Miss Williams," he said, folding his arms. "You seem quite confident with these problems." She nodded politely. "I've always loved math, sir." He tilted his head, studying her face. "We'll see how deep that love goes. Tomorrow, I have something special for you." Sarah smiled faintly. "All right, Professor. I'll be ready." As she walked away, Daniel's pride stiffened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he had already decided was beneath his level. That night, while Sarah reviewed her notes at home, Daniel sat in his study, scribbling a new problem on his whiteboard. It was one of his toughest, a problem that had once stumped even experienced researchers. He smirked. Let's see how our simple woman handles this. Little did he know. The challenge he was preparing would become the moment that shattered his arrogance and revealed the brilliance he had so foolishly underestimated. The classroom. The next morning would no longer just be a place for learning. It would become a stage where humility would meet hidden genius. And the man who thought he knew everything was about to realize how little he truly understood about people. Asterisk the next morning. Sarah woke up earlier than usual. The golden sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of her small apartment, spreading softly across her notebook, which lay open on the table. Equations filled every page, clean, neat, and precise, just like her thoughts. She took a deep breath, sipped her tea, and whispered to herself, "It's just another day. Stay calm." But deep down, she knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary day. Yesterday, Professor Daniel had told her he had something special for her. His tone wasn't kind. It was almost like a challenge. Sarah wasn't scared of difficult problems, but she knew men like him. She'd met professors like Daniel before, brilliant minds with fragile egos. They were fine until someone quietly outshined them by the time Sarah reached the National Training Center. The hallways were already buzzing with voices. A few students smiled at her. Others smirked quietly. Word had spread that the new simple woman had impressed the strict professor. Some were curious, some jealous. And a few simply wanted to see her fail. When she entered the classroom, Daniel was already there, writing on the board. His handwriting was sharp, every symbol precise, as if he was etching his pride into the surface. The board was filled with symbols, a complicated multi-step problem involving calculus, geometry, and logic. Even the brightest students stared at it, confused. Daniel turned around slowly, adjusting his glasses. His expression was calm, but his eyes had a spark of challenge. "Good morning, class," he said, his voice deep and deliberate. "Before we begin today's lecture, I thought we'd start with a small test. A demonstration, if you will." A few students exchanged glances. Tests weren't normal at the beginning of a lecture, and the way Daniel said it, a demonstration, made everyone tense. He looked straight at Sarah. "Miss Williams," he said, "would you do us the honor of solving this?" The room went silent. Sarah blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Me, sir." "Yes, you," Daniel said, stepping aside and motioning toward the board. "You seemed quite confident yesterday. Let's see that confidence in action." A quiet laugh came from the back of the room. Another student whispered, "She's done for." Sarah hesitated for a second, then stood up slowly. She didn't like attention, but running away wasn't her way either. "All right," she said softly, walking toward the board. The chalk felt cold between her fingers. She looked at the problem carefully. It wasn't just difficult, it was designed to humiliate. Multiple variables, hidden functions, and a trick that could easily lead to errors. It was the kind of problem only a teacher who wanted to prove a point would give. Daniel crossed his arms. "Take your time," he said smoothly. "If you need help, the class can assist." His voice carried a hint of sarcasm. Sarah didn't respond. She began to write slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. At first, she rewrote the equation neatly. Then, she started simplifying the terms. Her handwriting was beautiful, clean, organized, and confident. Within seconds, the noise in the classroom faded. Everyone watched as the simple woman they had underestimated began to shape order out of chaos. Daniel leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. Her method was unusual, elegant, almost effortless. She wasn't following the standard path. She was taking shortcuts, creative ones that still made sense. After a few minutes, Sarah paused, looked at the board, and smiled faintly. "That should do it," she said softly. Daniel frowned. "That's your answer?" "Yes, sir," she replied politely. Stepping aside, he walked up to the board, scanning the equations. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock. Then, Daniel froze. Her solution was flawless. Every step correct. Every simplification perfectly logical. And she'd reached the answer in half the time he'd expected. The students exchanged shocked glances. One of them whispered, "She actually solved it." Daniel turned back toward her. "Where did you learn this method?" he asked, his voice tight. Sarah looked confused. "It's just a simple transformation, sir. I used it before in my old research work." Her honesty disarmed him, but it also pricked his pride. "Old research work," he repeated. "You mean? You've done advanced mathematics before?" Sarah hesitated, not wanting to boast. "A long time ago," she said softly. "Before I stopped studying, the class began buzzing. One student whispered, 'Wait, is she that Sarah Williams? The one from the Math Olympiad?'" Daniel's expression shifted slightly. He had heard that name before, years ago, when a young woman had stunned the academic world by solving a problem even professors couldn't handle. But that couldn't be the same person, could it? He looked at her again. She stood there quietly, her face calm, her eyes gentle. There was no arrogance in her posture, no pride, just peace. Daniel felt something twist inside him, something between admiration and discomfort. He cleared his throat. "Fine," he said curtly. "That was acceptable. Take your seat." Sarah smiled slightly and returned to her chair. She didn't need applause or praise. The joy of solving the problem was enough for her. As the class continued, Daniel's mind wasn't on his lecture. His thoughts kept returning to that solution. The simplicity, the precision, the brilliance behind it. He couldn't deny it anymore. The woman he had tried to embarrass had just outsmarted him in front of his own students. When the bell rang, Sarah quietly packed her notebook and left the room. Daniel watched her go, the chalk still in his hand. He wasn't angry, not yet. But something inside him was unsettled. For the first time in years, he had met someone whose silence spoke louder than his authority. And though he wouldn't admit it, the simple woman had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about intelligence, pride, and humility. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The first spark of a lesson life was about to teach him. One that no classroom or equation could ever explain. The next day felt heavier than usual. The skies above the city were covered with soft gray clouds, and the air carried a strange stillness, the kind that comes before something important happens. Sarah walked through the tall glass doors of the National Training Center with her books pressed against her chest. She wasn't nervous, but she could feel the curious stares of the students around her. Ever since the last class, everyone had been whispering about her. Some admired her quiet brilliance, others couldn't stand it. "Did you see her yesterday?" one girl murmured to another. Even Professor Daniel didn't expect that answer. "Yeah," the other replied. "But let's see if she can keep it up. He won't go easy on her again." And they were right. Inside the classroom, Daniel stood by the board, his expression unreadable. He was holding a new set of notes, but not for teaching. He had spent all night creating something he called a test of intellect, though in truth, it was a test of his own pride. The previous day had bruised his ego. No student had ever made him feel less knowledgeable, especially not someone he had already labeled as ordinary. When Sarah entered, Daniel's gaze followed her. She gave him a polite smile. "Good morning, Professor," she said softly. He nodded once, then turned toward the class. "Today," he announced, "we will do something different. We'll solve a real-world math problem, one that most experts struggle with. Let's see how much genius this room really has." The students straightened up. Some were excited, others nervous. Daniel wrote a long, complicated equation on the board, a mix of geometry, probability, and number theory. Even looking at it made the class uneasy. Then, with a faint smirk, he said, "Miss Williams, since you did so well yesterday, why don't you show us how it's done?" A wave of murmurs spread across the room. Everyone turned to look at Sarah. A few students grinned, whispering, "He's doing it again." Sarah hesitated. "Sir, maybe someone else." No, Daniel interrupted sharply. "You seemed quite confident yesterday. Surely, a mathematical genius like you can handle something a little more challenging." His voice dripped with sarcasm. Sarah understood what this was. It wasn't about testing knowledge. It was about putting her in her place. Still, she stood up quietly and walked toward the board. The moment she picked up the chalk, Daniel stepped back with folded arms, watching closely. "Go ahead," he said. "We're all waiting." The room was tense. Sarah looked at the equation, analyzing it in silence. The chalk trembled slightly in her hand, not from fear, but from the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She began writing slowly, breaking down the first few terms. The class leaned forward, whispering among themselves. A few minutes passed. Sarah paused midway through the solution. Something about the equation felt off. There was a missing piece, a deliberate trick. She realized Daniel had written it that way on purpose, so no one could solve it completely. He smiled faintly, sensing her hesitation. "Is there a problem, Miss Williams?" Sarah looked at him, calm but firm. "The equation is incomplete, sir. There's a missing coefficient in the third variable." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Are you saying I made a mistake?" Sarah's tone remained respectful. "Not a mistake, sir. Maybe it was intentional. But if I assume the coefficient is 1, the result will lose meaning." The class gasped softly. They could hear the quiet tension between teacher and student. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then assume whatever you like. Let's see if you can reach an answer at all." Sarah nodded. She erased a small part of the board and continued. Her movements were calm, methodical. Bit by bit, the scattered symbols turned into structure. After several long minutes, she reached the end. Her answer appeared at the bottom of the board, clean and clear. She put down the chalk. "There," she said quietly. "That's the solution based on your equation." Daniel walked up to the board, his face expressionless. He looked over the work, checking every line. To his disbelief, even with the missing coefficient, her logic was flawless. She had found a way around his trap, using a mathematical substitution so rare that even he hadn't considered it. The class waited for him to respond. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, suddenly, he laughed, a short, sharp laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, turning toward the students. "Congratulations, Miss Williams. You've done something remarkable." There was a flicker of hope in her eyes, but it vanished with his next words. "You've managed to overcomplicate something simple. Maybe that's why real mathematicians don't waste time on irrelevant tricks." The room went silent. Sarah blinked, taken aback. "Sir, I only used what the equation allowed." Daniel raised a hand. "Enough. Please take your seat. Let's move on." The laughter began softly, a few students snickering under their breath. "Guess she's not so special after all," someone whispered. Sarah stood there for a second longer, the chalk still in her hand. She wanted to explain, to defend her method, but she saw it in Daniel's eyes. He wasn't looking for understanding. He just wanted to win. Quietly, she put the chalk down and walked back to her seat. She didn't cry, didn't argue, didn't let the embarrassment break her. But inside, something shifted. She realized that no matter how right you are, some people will never see beyond their pride. As the lecture continued, she stared at her notebook, her mind far away. She thought about her mother's words. "You don't need to prove your worth to those who refuse to see it." When the class ended, Daniel watched her leave without saying a word. The others left laughing, still talking about the failed genius. But Sarah's silence wasn't defeat. It was power, waiting to be revealed. That night, as she sat by her window, she opened a blank page in her notebook and began solving the same problem again, perfectly, elegantly, and this time with the missing coefficient restored. She looked at the answer and smiled softly. "You wanted to humiliate me, Professor?" she whispered. "But tomorrow, you'll see what real genius looks like." Little did she know. The next day would bring a revelation so powerful that it would change not only the class, but also Daniel himself, forever. The sun had barely risen when Sarah sat at her small wooden desk. Her notebook open before her. The same math problem from yesterday lay in front of her, the one Professor Daniel had used to humiliate her. Her tea had gone cold, but her mind was burning with quiet determination. She had replayed the entire class in her head. The laughter, the whispers, Daniel's mocking tone, but instead of anger, she felt something stronger. Focus. Sarah wasn't trying to prove him wrong anymore. She simply wanted to remind herself of who she truly was, the woman who once solved equations that experts couldn't. The young genius who used to find beauty in numbers. She took a deep breath and began writing. Her pen moved quickly, almost like it remembered what her heart had forgotten. Line by line, symbol by symbol, she rebuilt the equation, filling in the missing coefficient Daniel had left out. The solution unfolded like a puzzle she had solved 1,000 times before. Within minutes, the answer appeared elegant, exact, and undeniable. She stared at it for a long time, her eyes glistening. "You were right, Mom," she whispered softly. "They'll see one day. Not because I want praise, but because truth can't stay hidden." Later that morning, when Sarah walked into the classroom, the atmosphere was already buzzing. A few students smirked when they saw her. "She's back again," one whispered. "Guess she didn't learn her lesson yesterday," another added. "Maybe the professor will give her something simpler this time." Sarah ignored them and quietly took her seat. She opened her notebook and waited. Moments later, Professor Daniel walked in. He was composed as ever, but there was a certain sharpness in his eyes, a mix of curiosity and caution. He looked at Sarah for a second longer than usual, then turned to the class. "Good morning, everyone. Today, we'll be continuing yesterday's discussion on problem-solving methods." He began writing on the board again, a new equation this time, one even more complex than before. "This," he said, "is a problem that no one has solved completely. Consider it a challenge." The students leaned forward, fascinated. Daniel continued, "It requires logical precision and creativity, something very few possess." He glanced at Sarah. Perhaps Miss Williams would like to try again. This time the class didn't laugh. They waited. Everyone remembered what had happened last time. There was something about Sarah's quietness that had begun to unsettle even those who doubted her. Sarah stood up slowly. Her heart was steady now, her fear replaced by calm confidence. "If you don't mind, Professor," she said softly, "I'd like to show a different approach today." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "By all means," he said. Stepping aside, Sarah picked up the chalk. Her movements were slower than before, not hesitant, but deliberate. She began rewriting the problem, but instead of solving it directly, she broke it down into smaller patterns, showing connections between the numbers that no one had noticed before. As she worked, the classroom grew silent again. Every symbol she wrote carried purpose. She wasn't just solving an equation. She was telling a story through math. Minutes passed. Daniel, standing near the board, found himself captivated despite his pride. He recognized the logic behind her steps. It was advanced, yet graceful. She wasn't following any textbook method. This was her own style, pure intuition mixed with mastery. Finally, Sarah stepped back and put down the chalk. The board was full, but every line connected beautifully to the next. She turned toward the class and said quietly, "This is the result if you use a reverse mapping from the base function." Daniel walked forward slowly. He scanned her work, his eyes moving line by line. At first, he was silent. Then he looked up at her, disbelief written all over his face. This method isn't published anywhere," he said. Sarah smiled faintly. "It's something I discovered years ago. I called it cross-function mapping. It simplifies long expressions into shorter transformations." The students looked at each other, stunned. "Cross-function mapping," one whispered. That sounds like something from a research paper. Daniel stared at the board again, his ego cracking with every passing second. He checked her final answer, then rechecked it. It was flawless. He turned to her, his voice softer now. "Miss Williams," he said slowly, "where did you learn to think like this?" Sarah looked down at her hands. "I used to compete in national-level math contests," she said. Before I had to stop." A wave of realization washed through the classroom. One of the students gasped. "Wait, are you that Sarah Williams? The one who solves the unsolved Olympiad problem?" The room erupted in murmurs. "No way. That's her. I read about her years ago." Daniel's face turned pale. He remembered now, he had read about her too. A young prodigy who had stunned mathematicians across the country. A girl who vanished mysteriously after her mother fell ill. And she was standing right in front of him, the same woman he had mocked and tried to humiliate. For a long moment, Daniel couldn't speak. The pride that once filled his chest now felt like shame. He looked at Sarah, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a simple woman, not as a student, but as a quiet genius who had endured far more than he could imagine. The class broke into applause. Some students even stood, clapping for her brilliance. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, not for herself, but because the truth had finally found its voice. Daniel lowered his head slightly. "Miss Williams," he said quietly, his voice trembling, "I owe you an apology." Sarah shook her head gently. "No, Professor. You don't owe me anything. We all learn differently. Sometimes, even teachers need a reminder." For the first time in years, Daniel smiled a real smile, humble and human. "Indeed," he whispered. "And today, you've reminded me." As the class ended, Sarah gathered her things and stepped outside. The clouds that had covered the sky earlier had cleared, revealing bright sunlight. She closed her notebook and looked up, feeling the warmth on her face. The humiliation from yesterday had turned into victory. Not loud, not boastful, but graceful. She didn't just solve a math problem that day. She solved the deeper equation of pride and humility, and she had done it with kindness. And as she walked away from the building, even the wind seemed to whisper her name, Sarah Williams. The genius who taught a master how to learn again. The classroom was still buzzing long after Sarah left. Her name echoed like a quiet storm that had passed but left everything changed. Some students were still sitting in their seats, staring at the board full of complex equations she had solved effortlessly. Others were whispering, their voices filled with awe. "I can't believe it," one said. That was the Sarah Williams. The same one who broke that national record years ago. Another added, "She was a legend," someone whispered. And we laughed at her. The realization hit the room like a wave. Every person who had once judged her for her plain clothes, her simple demeanor, her quiet nature now felt a sting of shame at the front of the room. Professor Daniel stood motionless. His hands were still chalk-stained, but he didn't even notice. His mind was miles away, replaying every word. Every gesture he had made toward Sarah, the humiliation he had tried to give her, now belonged to him. He sank slowly into his chair, his eyes fixed on the spot where she had stood. For years, Daniel had believed he was unmatched, the kind of teacher who couldn't be surprised. Yet that simple woman had turned his world upside down with grace, intelligence, and humility. Later that evening, after the class dispersed, Daniel remained in the empty room. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and golden light streamed through the tall windows, reflecting off the chalkboard where her formulas still glowed faintly. He traced one of the lines with his finger, almost in reverence. "Cross-function mapping," he murmured. A student discovered something even I never noticed. His pride crumbled quietly. For the first time, he didn't feel like a teacher. He felt like a student, one who had just learned his most important lesson. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his office, searching through old records, his laptop screen glowing in the dim light. He typed Sarah Williams Mathematics Olympiad into the search bar. Dozens of articles appeared. Her face, younger, smiling, confident, stared back at him from the screen. He clicked one of the articles and began to read. Sarah Williams, the prodigious math talent from a small town, solved a problem that even leading mathematicians deemed unsolvable. Her discovery caught international attention. However, soon after, she disappeared from the academic scene to care for her ailing mother. Many believed her brilliance was lost forever. Daniel leaned back, guilt hitting him like a punch to the chest. He rubbed his temples and whispered, "So that's where she went. She gave it all up for family." In that moment, he realized how blind he had been, how quickly he had judged her by her simplicity instead of her story. He thought of how confidently she had walked to the board despite his cruel tone. How she had smiled, even when the class laughed. That wasn't weakness. That was strength, the kind he had never known. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the institute earlier than anyone else. He erased the old lessons from the board and, for the first time in years, felt eager to teach, not to show off, but to share. But before he could begin the day, the door opened quietly. Sarah stood there, holding her notebook. "Good morning, Professor," she said gently. Daniel froze for a moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Good morning, Miss Williams. I was hoping to see you." She looked surprised. "You were?" He nodded. "I owe you an apology. A real one." He took a deep breath. "I was arrogant. I saw your simplicity as weakness. I thought brilliance came dressed in pride and power. But you showed me that true intelligence wears humility." Sarah's eyes softened. "You don't need to apologize, Professor. We all make mistakes," he said firmly. "You don't understand. Yesterday, I tried to humiliate you. I wanted to prove you wrong because my ego couldn't handle being challenged. But when you solved that equation, you didn't just prove me wrong. You showed me who I've become." Sarah smiled faintly, her voice calm. "You're not the first person to underestimate me, sir. People often mistake silence for weakness." Daniel looked at her with genuine admiration. "You're remarkable, Miss Williams. The world should know your name again." She shook her head gently. "It doesn't matter. I didn't come back for fame. I came back to remember what I loved: math. Nothing more." Her words struck him deeply. In a world obsessed with recognition, here stood a woman who had mastered the art of purpose without pride. He nodded slowly. "Would you consider helping me teach this concept to the class? You've created something new, something powerful. It deserves to be shared." Sarah hesitated. "Teach me." "Who better?" Daniel said with a small smile. "You're the real expert here." The sincerity in his voice touched her. After a brief pause, she nodded. "All right, Professor. I'll help." When the students arrived that morning, they were shocked to see Sarah standing beside Daniel at the board. The same students who had laughed at her now sat quietly, their faces filled with respect. Daniel began the class. "Today, we'll learn something extraordinary," he announced. "A method discovered by one of our very own." He looked at Sarah with pride. "Miss Williams will be co-teaching this session." Sarah took a deep breath and began explaining her method slowly, patiently, just as she had done years ago when teaching neighborhood kids. The students listened with fascination, asking questions, taking notes eagerly. For the first time in a long while, the classroom didn't feel like a place of competition. It felt like a space of learning, respect, and inspiration. When the lesson ended, the entire class stood and applauded. Daniel turned to Sarah and said quietly, "You've reminded us what education truly means, not authority, but understanding." Sarah smiled. And you reminded me that even the proudest hearts can change. Outside, the sky was bright blue. The storm of pride, judgment, and ego had finally cleared. That day, a new respect was born, not just for Sarah's genius, but for her heart. And Professor Daniel, once blinded by arrogance, became her biggest admirer, not for her brilliance, but for the grace with which she carried it in that quiet classroom. A teacher had been humbled, a genius had been rediscovered, and humanity had found its most beautiful equation: kindness plus humility equals greatness. Asterisk. Days passed after that unforgettable class, yet the atmosphere inside the National Training Center was different, warmer, quieter, and more respectful. The gossip, the laughter, and the small judgments that used to fill the hallways had disappeared. In their place was something new: admiration, curiosity, and inspiration. For the first time, everyone looked forward to Daniel's lectures, not because of his authority, but because of the person standing beside him. Sarah Williams. Each day, Sarah co-taught with Daniel, breaking down complex mathematical ideas into simple, graceful explanations. Her voice was calm, her tone humble, and yet every sentence she spoke carried the weight of deep wisdom. She didn't just teach equations, she taught perspective. Every problem, she once told her class, has a solution. The trick is not to panic when you can't see it yet. The students listened like never before. Some of them had once laughed at her, but now they hung on to her every word. A few even came to her after class, shyly asking for guidance. Sarah never refused anyone. No matter how small the question, she answered with patience and kindness. Professor Daniel often stood at the back of the class, silently watching. He was no longer the proud, unapproachable instructor he once was. His eyes carried a gentleness that only comes after realizing one's mistakes. He saw in Sarah not a rival, but a reflection of what true teaching should be: selfless, humble, and compassionate. One afternoon, after class had ended, Daniel called the students together. The sun streamed through the tall windows, painting golden lines across the floor. "Before you all leave," he began, his voice steady but emotional, "I want to say something." The students turned their attention to him. Curious, Daniel took a slow breath and looked at Sarah, who stood quietly near the board. "A few weeks ago," he continued, "I made a terrible mistake. I judged someone not by their ability, but by their appearance. I let my pride blind me to true talent and to true humanity." The class was silent. Everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. He turned toward Sarah. "I tried to embarrass you," he said softly. "But instead, you taught me a lesson I'll never forget. You reminded me that respect isn't something we give to those who look powerful. It's something we owe to every person, regardless of who they are." Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "You've learned quickly, Professor," she said kindly. "And that's what makes you a great teacher." Daniel shook his head. "No, Miss Williams. You're the teacher here. I'm just a man who finally learned to listen." A small wave of emotion rippled through the room. The students began to clap slowly at first, then louder, until the whole classroom echoed with applause. Sarah blushed slightly, unused to attention, but her heart felt full. After the class, as the students left, Daniel and Sarah remained behind. The room was bathed in soft evening light. Daniel leaned against the desk and said quietly, "You've changed me." "Sarah, I used to think teaching was about being the smartest person in the room. But now I know it's about lifting others higher." Sarah smiled gently. "And I used to think my time in mathematics was over. You reminded me that knowledge never expires. It just waits for us to return to it." They shared a quiet laugh. It wasn't a laugh of superiority or pride. It was one of mutual respect, of two people who had finally found understanding through humility. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's influence began to spread beyond the classroom. The director of the institute heard about her teaching style and invited her to lead workshops. Students from other departments began attending her sessions, not just for math, but for motivation. She became known not just as a genius, but as the woman who teaches from the heart. Daniel often introduced her proudly during seminars. "Meet Miss Sarah Williams," he would say. "She reminded me that brilliance doesn't shout, it shines quietly." One evening, as Sarah walked home, she stopped by a small cafe near the institute. She sat by the window, watching people pass by, her notebook resting beside her. A group of young students entered the cafe, excitedly discussing her class. "She makes it look so easy," one of them said. "And she never makes us feel dumb." Another replied, "She's different. She believes in us, even when we don't believe in ourselves." Sarah smiled softly, sipping her tea. Hearing those words was worth more than any award or title. Later that night, she returned home. She found a small envelope on her doorstep. It was from Daniel. Inside was a handwritten note that said, "Thank you for reminding me what teaching really means. You didn't just solve an equation, you solved my arrogance." At the bottom, he had written, "You once said every problem has a solution. You were right. Sometimes the problem is pride, and the solution is humility." Sarah placed the note in her notebook and closed it gently. She looked up at the stars twinkling above and whispered, "Finally, the lesson is complete." That night, the once simple woman who had been mocked, underestimated, and tested didn't feel ordinary anymore. She didn't feel superior either. She simply felt free, free from doubt, from judgment, and from the need to prove herself in her heart. She knew the real victory wasn't in solving equations, it was in changing minds. And as for Daniel, he never forgot her. He continued teaching, but he did so with a softer voice, a humbler heart, and a deep respect for the unseen brilliance in others. In the end, Sarah didn't just awaken her own genius. She awakened something greater, a reminder to everyone that true wisdom isn't about how much you know, but how deeply you understand.